Y'all ready? Oh, now y'all sounding weak. This is supposed to be Harlem, New York. These people travel from far. I need Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and all of them to hear. Now, first of all, let me see who's in the house. Is Queens in the house? Anybody from Queens? Oh, Queens in the building, all right. Anybody from Long Island? Long Island, Long Island. All right, Long Island, you might have to join forces with Queens. I ain't go out there and do any promotion, you right. Way out there in the boondocks. Staten Island in the building. Okay, one person, Staten Island. You need to join forces with Queens.
Is this King Simon?
And Long Island, that's it. All right. I
don't like to be next to the lecture.
Hold on. Is the Bronx in the house? Bronx, let me boogie down. Ooh, boogie down, okay, boogie down, make it noise, boogie down, boogie down. Well, there's another island I gotta pick up, another island. Is Rikers Island in the building? I know some of y'all Negroes been there. It's all right, C-76. Don't drop the salt. Is Brooklyn in the house? Hey, hey. Now, look, I've been in Japan and Brooklyn was in the house. Brooklyn! Just saying. Are y'all ready? Well, this brother here, my elder, my Baba, and his beautiful sister, this is what I'm going to do. I want to bring up his empress to bring him on. Do y'all mind? Do y'all mind if the empress brings him on? Well, without further ado, I want y'all to stand up for our sister, because she's a lecturer in her own right, but she's the business mind behind Kemet New. Welcome on stage, Ashra Kwesi!
Thank you, brothers and sisters. Thank you, King Simon.
Okay.
I have the honor today to introduce the next speaker. I first saw Ashra Kwesi in 1989 at the Ramses Conference in Dallas, Texas. And there, it was a group called the Third Eye that sponsored the event. And they had a lot of African-centered speakers to come, but the one who rocked the house, the one who gave the slide presentation lecture that people still talk about today was Brother Ashra Kwesi. Fast forward to 1992. I was going on Dr. Ben's educational tour to Kemet with my family. And Dr. Ben came to the airport and he said he wouldn't be able to take us over, but he would meet us later and leave us in the hands of his assistant, Brother Ashra Kwesi. And Ashra took us over there because Dr. Ben trusted his trip to Brother Kwesi. And he had been Dr. Ben's assistant at that time by about 11 years, and later 14 years in all. Well, Brother Kwesi made Kemet come alive to us. Consequently, the very next year, I ended up getting married to Brother Kwesi. And Dr. Ben did our ceremony right at the temple of Ifitasut. Well, I found out over the many years that we've been married that Brother Kwesi actually lives in 3000 BC. Now, he doesn't remember anniversaries, he doesn't remember birthdays, but he can tell you the timeline on every temple in Kemet. He can give you the timeline on the pyramids of Khufu, Khafra, Menkaure. And many of you may come up to him and he may not remember your faces, but he'll tell you exactly who you look like on the walls of Kemet. So it's been a very wonderful experience, and I found too that Brother Kwesi has a strong desire to make the most impact he can on our people. He wants you to know about our story, not his story. So he will spend months, he will spend weeks, he will pour over these slides in order to make them have the greatest impact for you. He also makes sure that he stays fit. He exercises every day and eats right in order to be able to lead our tours to Kemet. He's also an astute businessman. And I came from a business background, so I knew exactly what was going on as I moved into the production company and the tour company as well. But he also made sure that he focuses on us, African people. You're not going to hear him talking about a whole lot of other things, but you're always going to hear him talk about Africa. You're always going to have him to talk about our people. So that's what they call a distinctive competency. Brother Kwesi, one thing about him too, he's just a down-to-earth brother. He's not going to ask for titles like doctor and scholar and all of that and professor. He just wants to be called Brother Kwesi. And the brother is always going to bring it hard. He's always going to be hardcore. And just like Tina Turner says in Proud Mary, she says sometimes people want to have it nice and easy. But he never ever does anything nice and easy. It'll be nice and rough. So brothers and sisters, I want you to stand on your feet, and I'm going to bring on my netter hetch, my divine husband, Brother Ashra Kwesi, coming to you in the spirit of that warrior scholar, Dr. Joseph Binyakini.
All right, I want to thank my netter hemp, my divine wife, for that introduction. I, her netter hedge, divine husband. See, we put divinity in our unity to go into eternity. And let me give credit to Mary Ross. She researched the netter hedge and the netter hemp, divine husband and wife. In fact, we also want to give another big hand to our Queen Mother Kandake, and that is Shaz Ali. Give her another strong African hand. I mean, when an African man takes an African woman, that's revolution today. So if you really want to be a revolutionary, brothers, take a queen. We have a spiritual dialectical laws of opposites, of Ma'at, truth, justice, and righteousness. Everything is opposites in the universe. So you definitely want to take that divine opposite. I was on the West Coast just last week, now the East Coast, so flying on those jets 700 miles an hour, you can definitely get turned upside down. So I want to say to you, Hotep, and to my brothers and sisters who are Muslims, Salam Alaikum. All those who are Hebrew say Shalom Alaikum. Christians, praise the Lord. Revolutionaries, Black Power. Free the land. What's up? After all that greeting, we have to ask, what's up? In the spirit of our Grand Master Teacher, Dr. Joseph Binyakini, that we affectionately know as Dr. Ben, it's an honor to be here today. May his spirit fly on the wings of Ra for eternity. And as my netter hemp, Mary Ra Kwesi, told you, that when I first met him back in 1973 at Long Beach State, I did not know the information that I'm going to lecture about today. In fact, I was in LA fighting the Gestapo beast LAPD. And Dr. Ben, that day, put our history as well as our black divinity and our black deity in a historical perspective that day. And I asked Dr. Ben, can you prove what you said here today? He said, young man, not only can I prove it, I can take you back and show you. That's the first time someone told me that they can show me. He said, but above all, we need young people like you to go back and do the field research. So again, that was my dream, to return back to Africa. I returned back to Africa in 1981 with him. I did not know that I would spend 38 years non-stop returning back to Africa after that first trip with him in 1981, spending 14 years with him doing field research, brothers and sisters. As I talk today, there are still those over there plundering temples and tombs, plagiarizing many ideas that has now become the Western version of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Christian, all the various religions, all came from the fallopian tube. I'm speaking of the fallopian tube of the Happy Valley. That Happy Valley is the Nile Valley, brothers and sisters, where it all began. Through their own documentation and research in anthropology, they have now agreed that the first people on the planet were black folks. Is that right? Does anyone disagree with that scientific evidence today? Raise your hand. Now, they have agreed with that, but they still don't want to accept that the idea of spirituality that led into religions, the idea of civilization, they still do not want to accept that that equally came from the fallopian tube of the Nile Valley. So you mean that our ancestors were just wandering around for millions of years, waiting for Europeans and Asians to come to tell us about God? Doesn't make any sense. But our ancestors wrote on the books in stone. I come with visual documentation because images shape our reality, and we have to open up an African ancestral genetic memory bank. As it says in West Africa, we have to go back to the Sankofa. We have to go back to retrieve that which we have lost to understand the present, to go into the future. Is that right? So again, this is not all the information to know. This is just a small piece of the information. Many of us in this room got the answers as well. But we have to unlock that ancestral genetic memory bank. As I make the analogy, if someone puts a mirror up to your face, you can see your face. But if they knock that mirror on the ground, it breaks up into many pieces. We can't take one piece and say, I got the answer. So we've got to take all the pieces to put together. So we want to think, let's give Nesu King Simon a big hand for this African Communiversity. Because that's what this is, an African Communiversity. Don't think because you go to white folks' schools that you're being educated. Many of us are just being trained to do a job for white folks. So true education is when you know who we are. As our ancestors said, know thyself, brothers and sisters. So again, this presentation involving by the way, turn off all the technology because we don't know who's who. You know, back in the day, you had those who lived in the big house and told master everything that was going on in the field. So now they got all this technology today, because the one thing that they haven't been able to control are the African communiversities like this. And like on the plantation, did we teach each other how to read on master's porch? Where do we go? Out to the bush. So again, equally, we're still in neo-slavery today. We don't want to expose everything that we're doing to white folks, because then they see where you're going and can checkmate it even before you get there. So again, this presentation is going to be on the African history and spirituality, the origin of the Bible and the Quran. Again, we're not here for you to believe in what I'm saying here today, but to think about what I'm saying here today. And once we have a critical analytical analysis and see where many of these ideas were plagiarized from the books in stone. We're talking about the temples and tombs that our ancestors wrote for thousands of years. Everybody said they're going to the Holy Land, but the world's first Holy Land, or Teneta Land, was right there in the northeast corner. We're talking about in the northeast corner is Kemet, is now called Egypt today. So we want to have visual documentation to research this information to give it validation, because after all, we're the last people that should be arguing whether we're Muslims or whether we're Christians or Hebrews, because without African people, none of it exists in the first place. So again, as long as our black divinity and our black deity or black God is in it, then we can work with that. Is that right? So we give recognition to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Here we a black theology. We give recognition to our brother Honorable Albert Clegg and the Black Madonna. Here we're seeing a black divinity and a black deity to deal with our African spirituality. So again, we want to thank again King Simon for this. For those of you who are here for the first time hearing me, raise your hand. Quite a few of us. See, we got a whole new class here, Brother King Simon. So we've had Christianity, the African mystery system. So today, African spirituality, origin of the Bible and the Quran. You got a good view up there? Also, before I go on, I want to give recognition to Dr. John Henry Clark, who I met him in Kemet. I met Dr. Clark in Kemet in 1981. I was sitting at the feet of the Grand Master Teachers, brothers and sisters. So again, we want to deal with the visual documentation and the chronology of all of this. When we think of the Bible, and many of us who know Adam and Eve and many of the patriarchs of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Solomon, and so forth, when we look at the Quran, we got the same story. The reason why we got the same story, because it's a compilation of the Old Testament and New Testament. For instance, in the Quran, we see Cain and Abel is called Qabil and Habil. In Quran, Noah is called Nuh, Abraham is called Ibrahim. And also we see in the Quran, Isaac is called Ishaq, Ishmael is called Ismail in the Quran, Salahim is called in the Quran. So we see the same story, Moses, and the Quran is called Musa. So we're seeing the same stories, but the question is, where did those stories come from? Where did those patriarchs get the idea of many of these stories? And we're going to see that the foundation of it came from the fallopian tube of the Nile Valley. Many of these spiritual systems are throughout the African continent. We see their various names. In West Africa, we see that the Orishas are identical to the Neterus, as well as many other places. But our ancestors, as Dr. Ben's favorite quote, we came from the beginning of the Nile where God happy dwelt at the foothill of the mountain of the moon. There we see our ancestors documented that in the Papyrus of Hunefer. And there that Great Lakes region was always recognized. We're talking about the Happy Valley with the Nile called the White Nile today and the Blue Nile. There we see our ancestors migrating down the Nile, reaching the zenith. This is the cultural highway. But that beginning did not start in Egypt. It started deep down in the Great Lakes regions of Africa. There our ancestors saw that beginning. So many of the stories that I'm going to talk about, that we have to go back to its origin. But we're going to start at this time period because when the Greeks came in and plundered many temples up and down the Nile in Kemet, that is called Egypt today, many of these places that the Greeks plundered and many of the temples that came in, these Bibles were developed because of plunder. We're a stolen people. They stole papyruses out of various temples up and down the Nile, built the Alexandria Library. This is how these various Bibles developed. And then we are told it's the infallible Word of God. Well, if it's the infallible Word of God, that word came from our ancestors. That our ancestors wrote on papyrus that later became paper, vellum, and various other materials that they wrote on. But these Greeks, who were the first to be introduced to this knowledge, and Alexander the Barbarian, who got Aristotle to plunder temples and tombs where they built the Alexandria Library. We know about the Alexandria Library, but we're not told where these books came from the various temples that he plundered. In fact, we see, how many of us know Neil deGrasse Tyson? There he had a documentary talking about the Alexandria Library, and even though he didn't mention none of the temples where they plundered to make up these various Bibles today. So let's let Neil deGrasse Tyson tell us something about the Alexandria Library.
In the city of Alexandria, named after and conceived by its dead conqueror, Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies, the Greek kings who inherited the Egyptian portion of Alexander's empire, built this library and its associated research institution. And what was then the greatest library on earth. Here, Eratosthenes, one of the chief librarians, accurately calculated the size of the earth and invented geography. Pythagoras.
What about Imhotep?
Hypatia. Euclid. Euclid set forth the precepts of geometry in a textbook that remained in use for 2,300 years. Bible comes down to us mainly from the Greek translations made here. The original manuscripts are the masterpieces of Greek comedy and drama, poetry, science, engineering, medicine, and history. The total work product of the awakening of ancient civilization was kept here. Estimates vary on the total number of scrolls. They range from 500,000 to nearly 1 million.
So he did not mention Imhotep. He did not mention Kejimi. He did not mention Ptahhotep. These are the grand masters long before these Greeks, long before Pythagoras and Euclid and many of the others. There we're going to see where they copied these ideas from. After all, the Hellenized Jewish scholars of the Bible of Alexandria compiled, rewrote, edited, and translated ancient Kemetic, they call Egyptian today, spiritual documents into Greek, and that became the Old Testament of the Bible. From the plunder of ancient Kemet that the Greeks called Egypt, we want to go back and see these spiritual places, like Menepher that the Greeks called Memphis. We want to look at Eno that the Greeks call Heliopolis. We want to go south where the temples are still intact of Waset that the Greeks call Thebes. And these spiritual places we see our ancestors, theosophical and spiritual ideas in these ancient spiritual centers long before the cemeteries of the Western world, or seminaries as they call them today. But it's Enu, that the Greeks call Heliopolis, where a lot of their knowledge came from. But there our ancestors saw it as the great creation of Atum. Not Adam, a man, but Adam of this ancient creation of the spiritual Neteros. So we see these various creation stories that they plagiarized from these many papyruses down through the millenniums. In fact, let's look at Ptah. In fact, in the African creation story, we say for there to be a god, it must be a goddess, and for there to be a goddess, it must be a god. Even in the African creation story was based off of God having a wife. And even though they said, let us make man in our own image, I've been asking who is this us for a long time to the preachers. They haven't been able to tell me. It must have been a marital dispute and she got kicked out of heaven. So they did not suffer from phagocytis. So again, our ancestors and their creation story. We said Ptah, the wife is Sekhmet, and the son is Nefertum, this early spiritual triad, the early African spiritual cosmogenesis. We go into these European universities and we go through the seminary schools, and none of these things are told about the earliest recorded creation story. Where Ptah in this early monotheism, yes, one God. Here Ptah is saying, let there be light. The earliest idea long before Genesis, and you can go into the Cairo Museum and see Ptah in an anthropomorphic form or human form, holding the scepter, that he's the supreme power of the universe, 3,200 years BCE, over 5,000 years ago, and even older than that if we go to Mer and Jehudi, the last African priest. There we see Ptah creating the universe, and yet when you go inside the tombs, he's jet black. Here our divinity was intact because there was no white supremacy, nor was any white images represented as God at this time. Even now they can't figure out how our ancestors used paint to last for thousands of years. But Ptah, the earliest idea of anthropomorphizing God in the human form, jet black, and now they're talking about dark matter is everywhere, the invisible spirit. We anthropomorphize this spiritual God energy as Ptah. There was no Jehovah God yet. There was no Allah yet. There was no term called God yet. It was not mentioned during this time of 4000 BC. But when white folks come up with their sketches of God, they give you a sketch. And it says, let there be light. And God said, let there be light. And there was light in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3. But yet, why do you get a sketch when you see the beautiful paint over 3,000 years ago with Ptah holding a scepter of his supreme power, creating the universe? Now, when we see the creation of the world, we are told that the creation of the world, Archbishop James Usher in 1630 announced that the world was created by God on October 22nd at 9 a.m. in the year 4004 BC. That should be a big celebration, don't you think? But where did he get this idea of the creation of the world 4004 BC? Going through the various museums where they stole the knowledge from Kemet and Colossals. I mean, after all, they stole us. So we're the first people that should ask questions. After all, we're stolen people. Let's go into the British Museum. Asians and Europeans, they bypass this stone right here. That stone is called the Shabaka stone of the Memphite theology story, Ptah creating the universe. There's Shabaka, this stone here, Shabaka, this Kushite king in the 25th dynasty around 716 to 702 BCE. There, it was already owed to him. And here he brought the stone back, telling of his ancestors here in the Medu Neter, where Ptah is actually creating the universe. In the earliest language of the Medu Neter, there was no Aramaic yet, there was no Arabic yet, there was no English language yet. Here we see the earliest language of the Medu Neter, where Ptah is creating the universe. Translate that into English, it says this: I came forth from among the plants which I created, and I created all things which creep and crawl. Does that sound like a familiar account? And all that exists among them, and then by the powers and principles of light and air, and the powers and principles of moisture, heaven and earth, were brought into being from the womb of Nut. Heaven, okay, Nut, heaven, Asar, and Aset were brought into being, and they gave birth to the multitude of the land. So we see the heaven is created. The first man and woman, Asar and Aset, were created. There was no Genesis. There was no Jehovah God creating the universe yet. Our ancestors, from their empirical observation of what they referred to as Nature or Mother Nature, they observed these natural forces. They saw the heavens as a goddess. That goddess is Nut. Here the African man saw her as a goddess. He's looking at his natural empirical observation. Why is he going to see Nut as a goddess as the heavens? Because in the spiritual dialectical laws of opposites, we said there was a macro womb and a micro womb. The macro womb, we see Nut gave birth to the S-U-N son, like our mothers gave birth to the S-O-N son in the micro universe. Shu is the air, Geb is the earth, told in anthropomorphic or human form for us to understand it. Out of these elemental forces, the first man and woman are created, Asar and Aset. Notice that they're jet black, still painted on the temples and seeing the black divinity. This is what the Europeans saw when they came into European. This is where we see where they demonized and vilified our image. Aset's got the throne on her head. In order for the man to sit on the throne, he must come through her. What man can sit here and say he did not come from his mother's womb? Please stand up and tell us where you came from. We would like to know, brothers and sisters. There was no story in the African creation story that a rib was taken from Asar to make a set. There was no misogyny or story like that, because in this creation story, the cosmic goddess of Ma'at, they were created simultaneously. There was no rib taken from Asar to make a set. In this creation story, we see player hating going on back then too. I got to lay the foundation, because in the creation story, we see there's evil, like the evil brother named Set, who was jealous of him because he was a good man, Asar. There he got 72 conspirators to cut him up into 14 pieces. And here we see the first time of a storytelling of the good brother who was killed by the evil brother. The evil brother being Set, the Zoop type is the aardvark, and then we see the good brother is Asar, killed by his evil brother. There was no Cain and Abel story yet. This is where the Cain and Abel story came from. When we look in the books in stone and go to the temple of Aset, where we take brothers and sisters, where our ancestors wrote on the monuments as though they knew that one day we might forget our story. And Aset's going to raise Asar back up to life through what? Something called the Neta Ankh. What is the Neta Ankh? Divine life. Why would they use that symbol of the Neta Ankh? Where is life going to come from? Our mother's womb. What symbol are they using to represent that? The uterus. Where are we all coming from? That was the Neta Ankh, the symbol of divine life. So our revolution is going to come through the sister's womb. That's our nation. In fact, every time a sister walks by us, we should bow to her womb. Because without that womb, as our Queen Mother told us, we would not be here. So again, that's told on the books in stone. This is the importance of these reliefs. The other groups are not getting this. They're not showing them that over there, because of the misogyny of the story of the Cain and Abel story. And then we are told of Cain and Abel because Eve ate from a tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's the reason for the world's sins. That's another story we'll deal with later. But I said every king that came to the throne, she put the Neta Ankh, divine life, up to his nostrils, giving him the breath of life. Now when we look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, it says, the Lord God formed man, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. These are the books in stone where they copy these ideas from. There was no European Judaism, did not exist yet. In these early writings, long before the various Bibles, there is the Per Emerald that the Europeans called the Book of the Dead. They called it the Book of the Dead because they came in robbing and stealing from our ancestors. We rolled those scrolls up to go into the afterlife. So they called it the Book of the Dead because they were robbing the ancient tombs and desecrating the ancient cots that they called the mummy. It was not about a physical resurrection, but a spiritual resurrection of the Sahu spiritual body that I deal with in the African origin of Christianity. But they're the robbing of the Per Emerald, coming forth by day and by night. This is why they called it the Book of the Dead. So when we hear Book of the Dead, I don't want to hear nothing about a Book of the Dead. But it's the foundation and the basis of these various Bibles down through the millenniums from the Per Emerald. Means coming forth by day and by night. When we do a comparative analysis and see where these ideas were copied, we can go to Genesis, which is a Greek word that means the beginning. There, as I said, the Greeks copied from the papyruses to come up with these names. Our ancestors called it Zeptepi, meaning the first time of creation that we talked about, Ptah creating the universe. When we look in Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, and God called the light day and the darkness he called night. Is this where they got coming forth with the idea of day and night from coming forth by day and by night in the Per Emerald? Was this plagiarized from the temples? Even when we look at Genesis, it talks about this beginning. It's not talking about the beginning somewhere in the Tigris Euphrates. That beginning, even though it's mentioned in the Bible, but the very place it's talking about is the original Tanata land. As my ancestors said, we came from the beginning of the Nile when I was with Dr. Ben. And there we see the Abai River that James Bruce calls the Blue Nile. And we see from Lake Tana where the river is compassing the whole land of Ethiopia. And I said, I've seen that before in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, and the river went out of Eden. In verse 11, it says, in the name of the first of the son, that is which compass the whole land of Havilah, that's one of the sons of Cush, Ethiopia, where there is gold. And then it goes on to say in Genesis 2, verse 13, and the name of the second river is Gilhon, the same as it that compasses the whole land of what? You tell me. Ethiopia. Where? Ethiopia. So the opening page is not talking about Rome. It's not talking about Greece. It's not talking about nowhere in Europe. It's talking about the heart of Africa, way down here in Ethiopia, where the river is compassing the whole land of Ethiopia. Now, to show you the importance of why we got to know our story, because they make these documentaries and it goes out all over the world. So let's see what white folks say. Sometimes, you know, it ain't right unless it's white. Can my little speaker, can you hear it?
Special holiday event.